Hello, and good day, everyone. This is David Fortney with Fortney and Scott in Washington, D.C., and we want to welcome you to today's Lunch and Learn addressing coronavirus and the workplace. Joining me today to discuss this very timely topic is both Nita Beecher. Nita, do you want to say hello?
Hi, everyone. Looking forward to this conversation.
Likewise, and Bert Fishman. Bert.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us, folks.
You know, I was just thinking while preparing for this discussion that among us, for better or worse, Hello, and good day, everyone. This is David Fortney with FortneyScott in Washington, D.C., and we want to welcome you to today's Lunch and Learn addressing coronavirus and the workplace. Joining me today to discuss this very timely topic is both Nita Beecher. Nita, do you want to say hello?
Hi, everyone. Looking forward to this conversation.
Likewise, and Bert Fishman. Bert.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us, folks.
You know, I was just thinking while preparing for this discussion that among us, for better or worse, we literally have over 100 years experience and expertise in addressing workplace crises. And I must say, this is truly unprecedented and perhaps one of the most challenging situations that any of us or any employer has faced or will face. So it's a serious topic. We want to jump right into it. Just briefly about FortneyScott, for those that aren't familiar, this is the type of work we do. We do counsel and advise employers, including federal contractors, and we do so on a broad spectrum of workplace matters, and particularly involving the federal and state workplaces and compliance with the governing requirements. Of course, today, although we are lawyers, the purpose of today is not to afford you with legal advice. We would encourage each of you to consult with your respective legal counsel to ensure that the advice you receive fits your specific facts and circumstances. But with that, let's turn, because we have a lot of ground we want to cover in the 60 minutes that we're going to share with you. Just as a rundown, we want to first make sure that you are right up to date with today. And of course, as we know, even in the last 24 hours, events are changing rapidly. So this will be just date stamped with where we are at the moment. We're going to also review some of the underlying legal obligations. We'd like to spend roughly half the time addressing that to ensure that you don't, through unintentional rapid responses, perhaps violate or overlook some of your legal obligations, because there's a number of them. And then we want to really focus the second part of our discussions today on practical suggestions based on what we see in developing responses. And then we want to share with you a couple of final thoughts. So it's going to be, I think, a really very substance-filled program, and I don't want to delay any. So, Bert, let's start with, where are we today?
Well, I say this with a small mountain of salt. This was as of this morning. It is radically different from this time yesterday. There are now over 1,269 cases. There are now 37 deaths in 44 states in the District of Columbia. From what we've learned over the last few days and what we heard last night from Dr. Fauci, the odds are that these numbers will increase exponentially. You all know that governments and private businesses are responding to an expanding situation. A worldwide pandemic has been announced by the World Health Organization. Your business and other businesses are responding in a variety of different ways. Travel bans, colleges closing, schools closing, the last of which raises enormous problems for parents taking care of children. The millions of children that are being fed breakfast and lunch, there is no backup program for all of them. It's hard to admit that for many of these millions, that's the main reason to go to school. Access limits, DC declared a state of emergency, banning all organizations from having gatherings of 1,000. Most cultural organizations are responding. And then, of course, you've all heard about the NBA, which got everybody's attention last night. I imagine that over the next few days and weeks, we will see more and more of similar responses, making it imperative that you put yourself in a position to respond to and act in accord with the number of state, local, and municipal rules that you'll be hearing.
So with that, let's turn briefly to ensure, so as a foundational concept, that we do kind of refamiliarize ourselves and remind ourselves of what those legal obligations are. And Nita, can I ask you to lead that part of the discussion for us, please? Kick it off.
Sure. Thank you, David. I appreciate that. And Bert, will be turning to you momentarily. It's interesting as we talk about through all these things, Bert and David and I were talking, these are things that we really don't often think about. And Bert's going to lead us off talking about the OSH Act and having to report this as part of your OSHA obligations, which we're not quite ready to go to yet. And then we've got, we're to talk ADA and disabilities, the personal health information, wage and hour discrimination, and workers' comp. And then we'll conclude this portion discussing collective bargaining and obligations around that. So, Bert, do you want to kick us off with the OSH obligations, which many of us are not that familiar with?
I'd be happy to, but David says he's going to.
All right, I'll jump on that.
I'll
jump on that. Actually,
I'm sorry. It is
that's
David.
Okay. So the Occupational Safety and Health Act, it's been around since 1970. Richard Nixon signed it into law, and it's as timely today, 50 years from its passage as it was then. Most of us, candidly, in our day-to-day business operations, probably don't think much about the OSH Act. There are a couple points, though, that we need to be familiar with. First is the general duty clause that effectively all employers, as a practical matter, participating in this call, you have a duty to furnish a worker with a workplace, basically a safe and healthy workplace is what the standard boils down to. There's the federal law. A number of states, they have the option, they have their own state plan, so depending on your particular jurisdiction. But at the end of the day, all businesses have this general duty to provide a safe and healthy workplace. Many of us in today, the realities of today, it's not just our own employees. We have contractors, we have subcontractors, we have people embedded that are working often shoulder to shoulder and doing very important components of our job. And the legal obligations with respect to a safe and healthy workplace also extend to those workers too. So it becomes if you will, the host, primary in sense, your obligation extends not just to your own workers, but more broadly to those, think of them as business invitees that you're bringing in. One of the questions that really has been teed up, and OSHA has issued some guidance on, you are supposed to do things like record certain workplace injuries, more serious injuries. If you get the cold, you don't have to record that. If someone gets the flu, they don't have to record that. A question that is rapidly evolving and being raised by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, by OSHA itself, is whether employers have to record the coronavirus infections, COVID-19 rather, infections that may occur in the workplace. OSHA's preliminary indications, there's not a formal rule, is that you may have to. Obviously, that raises a host of questions in determining whether someone actually contracted the virus or the illness in your workplace or elsewhere in their travels. I would put that as a developing point that we're looking to OSHA on, but not one that's yet fully robust. There are other components where the Occupational Safety and Health Act, or OSH Act as it's known, may come into, which is what are your obligations in terms of providing employees with personal protective equipment, which in this case is really a mask or gloves. Do you have to provide them? And generally, in this instance, at least today, the guidance that's out there with CDC suggests that they're not necessarily effective to prevent infection. It's really more to minimize for those that are infected. So those sorts of levels of accommodation, the OSH Act is something that I think many have overlooked, and that we wanted to make sure that is on your radar screen, the general duty clause particularly.
Now, all I would like to add is that if anybody is concerned about why you're taking the measures you're taking, the OSH Act is the basis for your being able to take steps to provide a healthy workplace.
Right.
Period.
So requiring people, for example, at a minimum to wash hands or to use hand sanitizers, to keep social distancing in the workplace, maybe not to have shared food supplies or other things like that may have existed. Changing those practices, I would suggest to you that the OSH Act, if common sense didn't compel it, the OSH Act provides a nice legal point. All right. Nita, do you want to talk a little bit about this another component, another area of the law that we think many have not fully thought through, disabilities? Nita, you with us?
Sorry, guys, I was on mute. No,
Okay.
talking about disabilities, I think it's an area which we don't think very much about, but the most important thing, and this has come up as close to home as St. Louis, where confidentiality of who actually becomes ill. We have that obligation under the Americans with Disabilities Act, as well as 503. Employers need to keep those personal health information confidential. That can get a little sticky if you end up with someone sick in the workplace. Everyone wants to know, well, who was it? Who was I near? And why are you telling me these? I want to make sure I know who it was. We're not supposed to be telling people that. And it's the other side of that, and to some extent, the reason for the confidentiality is to guard against harassment and stigmatization. And I think certainly initially in this pandemic, which has occurred, I think people were staying away from individuals from China, perhaps staying away from individuals from Italy, and certainly weren't drinking Corona beer, which I thought was fairly interesting. I know.
Right.
Eat in Chinese restaurants, exactly. But in the workplace, that's going to be an issue, although I think many employers have simply solved the problem by sending everyone home and having them work from home. But there are many places where it's not possible to do that. There have been questions raised about if someone is feeling ill or looks ill, should you have them take a temperature? Can you tell them, I want to take your temperature and see if you're ill? I think that raises all kinds of issues under the ADA as well. It's only in limited circumstances that employers should inquire that directly into someone's health. I think if you believe someone's ill, you should just send them home to avoid other people getting sick. And I think short of that, you can end up in a situation where you might be treating the individual as though they are regarded as disabled, which creates a whole host of potential liabilities. And David and Bert, I think direct threat is a very unlikely situation where an employer should go further than simply sending someone home if they believe they're sick.
As it turns out, the more and more jurisdictions that are declaring states of emergency provide a basis for an employer to say, in this circumstances, I am justified in a disability-related inquiry, asking someone to take a temperature test, even sending them for a virus test. Unfortunately, your doctor has to approve that, and they aren't much available. But
and it takes days to get the result.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a
correct.
practical matter.
Several days.
Don't we have to I'll say discreetly remove them from the workplace, minimizing identification to others, and if they do end up testing positive, then that poses further questions and issues regarding potential exposures to people and notification.
Exactly.
And I just would cite as recently as this week, one of our federal agencies, the Securities and Exchange Commission, had exactly that scenario. It happened to be a lawyer who was assessed of being tested and appeared to be positive, and the agency notified all other workers in proximity, removed them from the workplace till they could get it sorted. And that is, I think, a good little case study from the last 48 hours. It's instructive.
It's going to be an example of what other entities do.
Yeah.
Well, and I think you were speaking about, I think you were speaking about the NBA last night. That's a perfect example. One of the players had tested positive. They were playing the game. They stopped the game and removed everyone instantly.
Right.
Because the person had tested positive. So, but this is related to, and we're going on to HIPAA. We also have HIPAA obligations. Again, we're not allowed to disclose individually identifiable health information, except to appropriate authorities. And so, again, we need to protect any health information we as employers have, except as needed to to the public health services people saying this person did test positive, and these were the people that they were in contact with in my workplace and so forth, vendors and all that type of thing. At this point in time, it may be I know that when we go to the doctor, we have to sign the consent that allows them to disclose health information to the insurance companies and so forth. So perhaps employers have employees sign a written consent to disclose any information around coronavirus investigations or that type of thing, and do that up front.
This has become a very significant issue because testing kits are now going to be provided by LabCorp and other private entities. The integrity and completeness of the data collection is now imperiled, so that your reporting to the appropriate health authority becomes very important for helping the government and helping the rest of us understand the extent of the community spread and other spreads of the virus. Let me pick up with
with
the kind of rubber meets the road here.
Wage hour.
Yeah, now we leave illness-related laws and get to where the rubber meets the road. The Fair Labor Standards Act, which of course is the omnibus act regarding how you pay your employees, it does not address, require the availability or use of leave time, including sick leave, PTO, vacation, or anything like that. However, over the past 5 or 6 years, states have become extremely active in passing their own sick leave laws. So all of you, if you have not yet checked on what your local jurisdiction requires in terms of paid leave, paid sick leave, availability of short-term disability, now is the time to do it. Unfortunately, the Fair Labor Standards Act will not be quarantined, so all of those 100-year-old provisions still apply. Non-exempt workers, that is to say your hourly workers, if they are sent home for any reason, they do not get wages. They are paid for working hour by hour. That does not mean that they don't get sick leave or paid leave or other sorts of leave, but they are not on the clock. If you have a provision and have the capability of permitting non-exempt workers to work remotely, Fair Labor Standards Act is not suspended. You must track their hours so that they can be appropriately compensated, including overtime. And that is a technological challenge. It is a procedural challenge. It is something you should start thinking about immediately, because more and more governments will start ordering businesses to be closed or to operate virtually.
I just would add, Bert's addressing the legal obligations because some folks are sending non-exempts out of the workplace where they're not actually working, but they're still putting them on some basic stipend or, compensation. These are just in terms of what your legal minimums are. Yes.
Exactly.
No work, no pay.
Exactly. Now, the opposite applies to exempt employees, your white-collar workers, your managers, your supervisors. The old rule is still here, and the government just said 2 days ago that it's still in place. If an exempt worker works any work during a week when work is available, they must be paid for the whole week. That is the salary basis test. So if anybody does any work, sending emails, working your phone tree, that is work. And if they work during a week, they are paid their salary. On the other hand, if an exempt worker stays home for a full day, they do not get their salary, but they can dip into any available leave, their leave bank, their PTO, their vacation, and now is the time to start making those computations. I say this fully recognizing that there are reputational, morale, and other implications that you have to deal with in suspending pay when someone's not doing work. The only problem with that, and many of our clients are facing this, certainly our small local clients, if you're sending people home, that probably means your customers aren't coming through the door. There's going to come a point where those two vectors meet, and you may not have the funds to fulfill your wishes about maintaining compensation.
Well, yeah, Nita, one of the other areas, of course, is potential for discrimination claims arising, and let's talk a little briefly about what some of those considerations are and obligations are, Nita.
Well, so we're looking at, again, it's similar to what we talked about earlier, and one of the things we're very concerned about is how we're going to guard against harassment or stigmatization on any protected basis, whether ethnicity, national origin, Italy or China, age, because many people believe that only older people are going to be extremely ill. And by the way, the numbers don't show that, race or gender. And someone gets ill and comes back, let's move down the road. Someone has been ill, they stay home, things get back to normal. Are those people going to be stigmatized because they might get the illness again? They were out, they caused other people to be sick. Those are all things that, especially once we get through this initial part, employers are really going to have to stay on top of. The EEOC put out some very excellent, when we had the pandemic in 2009, information and guidance on how to handle this from the EEOC's perspective. Basically, to make the best efforts to learn what, for example, we know that DC has now declared a state of emergency, for example, and to make reasonable assessments of the conditions in their workplace. But I think some of this, to be honest, David and Bert, is going to come up after people, perhaps in places where people have to continue to work, for example, in manufacturing or in retail, but also for those people like Amazon and others. Google sent everybody home when they come back into the workplace after we get through this initial, the initial rush of this pandemic. We'll see some of this potential harassment or stigmatization potentially in the workplace, and that's something employers are going to have to deal with when it occurs.
Well, and we had a couple situations, even as this virus was just beginning back in January, become more widely known from China. There was a lot of demonstrated harassment and stigmatization directed at Asians, simply
Correct.
because of that. And
exactly.
So, obviously, this is something that, as employers, if you get a whiff of this, you need to address it promptly. Don't wait for a formal complaint. You know, as they say, if you see something, say something, do something. And we're big proponents of that. Big proponent of that. So, well, let me just briefly touch on workers' compensation. Something that as we look down the road and think again about the legal foundational elements, obviously if someone becomes injured, this would be considered an occupational exposure, in the course of their employment, they may be entitled to receive disability benefits and offsets for wages, etc. Probably most folks think of this more as if a person has a physical, they break an arm, they fall off a ladder or something doing a task, but also the coronavirus potentially and likely in some settings will also include a workers' compensation response. Again, this is something everyone has workers' compensation. You have workers' compensation carriers and representatives. Coordinate with them in the event that you have anyone that sustains a coronavirus-related injury in the workplace. Final point on a legal foundation that we wanted to touch on that, again, we're finding not everyone is thinking about are collective bargaining obligations. We have, obviously, those of you that have any organized or union represented workforce, generally you have to bargain with the union over terms and conditions of employment. Most of you probably have a collective bargaining agreement in place, and it will provide specific obligations and all the points we've really talked about, how you respond to people in the workplace, how you assign work, how you remove people from the workplace. Typically, all of these terms, to some degree, are addressed in a collective bargaining agreement. Some agreements contain kind of an extraordinary circumstance, what we call a force majeure clause, that might provide a basis for the employer to unilaterally act. Not all. You need to look at your CBA and see if that's the case. Any changes in either in your labor agreement or in the practices related thereunder likely will trigger a bargaining obligation, because it's what's called a term and condition of employment, and it's a mandatory subject of bargaining. Practical point: if you have a union, you should discuss with the union, ideally now, hopefully at this very early stage, how you're going to respond, what the responses are going to be, and see if you can secure alignment with the union. Final point on collective bargaining, and this is not self-evident but may apply to the vast majority of you. Those of you that do not have unions, you still may have collective bargaining and obligations under this statute. And that is that the non-union or non-represented employees still have the right in collective action relating to the workplace, that you cannot retaliate or respond adversely to that. For example, the employees at the Louvre Museum 2 weeks ago said one of our colleagues got sick, and we also are very afraid that all the people, the million people that tromp through the museum, we're going to get sick in our workplace. Therefore, we don't want to work. So they didn't have a sick out. They just said, we're not going to work. Now, in America, that would trigger a whole series of obligations in terms of how you respond to that. So the point is, be aware that when employees raise this isn't about necessarily their personal safety. It's about the workplace safety, and you do not want to give them kind of an offhand or summary disposition. You should be thoughtful and mindful of this.
Yeah, the one thing I'd like to add is many collective bargaining agreements are rather rigid in how they're structured, especially in terms of layoffs and time off work.
Right.
This is a situation where you're really going to have to act somewhat creatively. The people you need are your technologically trained workers, your IT workers to set up your remote telecommuting systems. They are probably much more recently hired than some other workers, and you have to start thinking and talking about that right away.
Those critical skills. That's a good topic to raise in those early discussions with the union. All right. Well, those from what we're seeing in counseling clients really represent kind of I'll call it the top tier, top line legal issues that many clients, considerations, I should say, that clients have not necessarily been aware of because they're rushing to respond and trying to be thoughtful and concerned about their workforce and maintaining their business. And what we thought we'd do is try to take a little bit of some practical responses. These are a bit of lessons learned that we've seen in dealing with a number of clients around the country of different sizes and different types of workplaces in how we think that employers can really benefit as they now begin to design and implement their own procedures to get ready. So let's talk about designing some of these practical responses. And Bert, maybe you can kick off on some of what do you do with respect to sick leave and PTO?
Well, obviously this is first on everybody's list. Many companies are already adjusting or trying to adjust the timing and the use and availability and reducing barriers to use. The first thing you can do, because it's your policy, is to get rid of all of the distinctions and barriers between PTO, sick leave, vacation, FMLA, make them available for use as much as possible, get rid of the distinction of using sick leave only for yourself. The point being, and we heard it again last night from Dr. Fauci, we want exposed and ailing employees to stay home, and your primary goal is to make it easy for them to make that decision. In the main point of the president's speech last night with respect to workers here is to try to support them financially if they have to go home. And that's your first job, and you have to do it with respect to your financial capabilities. Some companies have short-term disability programs, particularly if you're self-insured. That means you control the terms of your STD program, which means you can get rid of the exclusion period. You can do all kinds of things to make your STD options available. If you have an insured program, now is the time to start talking to your insurer about making those same kinds of adjustments so that if people have run out of their PTO, but they are sick and you want to try to support them financially, this is an option that is available. Many employers have already started to alter the rules. We have a couple of people on this call who are, in fact, representatives of hospitals and healthcare facilities. They are already taking much more extreme measures, both to protect their healthcare providers and to protect their patients in this way, to see if they can do rotating work, work sharing, to see how they can get workers who need time off to lose compensation. Final point, it's almost an asterisk at this point. Healthcare providers are overwhelmed, so please, if you have return to work policies, give them a waiver for the next few months. If someone is healed, has been quarantined or self-quarantined, and wants to come back to work, just say, come on back.
They've demonstrated they've conformed at a minimum with the CDC guidelines.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
They've been out for 14 days, stuff like that.
And one thing, before we jump to that slide, I just wanted to mention FMLA. Many people's FMLA policy has all kinds of hoops people have to jump through, and employers may want to look at that and reduce those hoops for FMLA, because you want the employees to work from home if they're ill or need to take care of someone else who's ill.
Right. And an interesting question, practical point, increasingly people may be fully able-bodied, but their children are no longer in school. Yeah. And I'm talking, grade school, younger children, that one of the functions at school, in addition to providing meals in some cases, is childcare that enables a significant portion of our population to work. That is not clear that is within the four corners of FMLA leave, but it's interesting, maybe. But
well, FMLA provides a floor, not a ceiling.
It's a floor. It's correct. We do not view it. It is a minimum. It's like a minimum wage. Most of you don't pay more than the minimum wage because the market demands it. So this is a significant component that a big segment of the workforce is going to be facing. I can't come to work because my child can't go to school. Yeah. I'm fine. Everyone in my house is medically fine. What are you going to do? And I think most employers are responding saying, well, you obviously have to take care of your children, and we have to facilitate how to do that.
I know some of my clients have already waived the must be at work for 1 year to qualify for FMLA.
Oh, good.
The next hurdle is how are they going to provide the funding?
The funding, right.
I wanted to mention one other thing before we jump over to the healthcare. Back on paid sick leave, we are seeing a number of companies that basically have hourly workers who, if they are sick, will not get paid, providing up to 2 weeks paid sick leave for those who get the illness. And we're talking Walmart, we're talking restaurants and others, Olive Garden, McDonald's. That is a huge change for employers of that type to provide paid sick leave.
And dramatic situations require dramatic responses.
Well, and I just want to say, there's a short run and long run. And Bert, you've highlighted appropriately the short run consideration, which is the concern about, can we afford this? Mm-hmm. And every business has to grapple with that. There is some long run aspects, which includes, certainly our experience bears out that when you stand with your employees, they respect that. If you commit to them, there often is a commitment back. Yes, there may be people who abuse, but I think generally there is an opportunity for goodwill and reciprocity that you may enjoy. And many workers will say, look, they allowed me to continue. I'm committed to this company. They stood by me when the times were tough. And even if they couldn't give me full wage, they gave me something to help me keep going, and I want to stick with them. And it's just, there's a lot of ways of looking at this, but sometimes in the heat of what's our financial consideration, there's a workforce morale consideration too that's very important.
I agree.
Okay. Let me get to some more practical considerations, mainly about healthcare coverage, especially with respect to workers sent home. Almost all of you, have insured healthcare programs. If someone is not working, your policy has to be looked at, because there is a time at which, under the terms of that policy, that the worker will no longer be covered. At the end of that period, coverage is usually suspended unless you have consulted with your carrier, or you are self-funded, or some other way has been found to fund the premiums to keep that idle worker on your policy. The same is true if an idle worker can't pay their share of the premiums. That person will be removed from the policy and enter COBRA, unless you have taken steps in advance, if possible, to try to continue to pay the employee share of premiums just as you would and are obliged to do under an FMLA situation. So start thinking about your health insurance policy as somewhat malleable to see if it can be adjusted to meet an emerging situation such as we've not faced in the past.
Super. All right. Juanita, we've sort of touched on this, but what would you help us kind of get our arms around some of these specific policies, telecommuting, time tracking, and some of these other things that are going to be really important?
Absolutely. And as someone who's been telecommuting for 20 years, this is right in my wheelhouse.
Yep.
We're seeing this already. Make it, that employers are sending people en masse home. As I mentioned, I believe earlier, Google is having all North American employees work from home. And I think if you want to continue your business and you want to try to prevent people from getting sick, this is going to be the way to go. But in order to do that, one, many employers have somewhat difficult telecommuting policies. It's a one-on-one, you have to go to your supervisor, you have to get all kinds of permission. This is a time to remove all the red tape and make it very easy for your employees to work from home. And as part of that, you're absolutely going to have to figure out what do you need for that. And I think either Bert or David mentioned your IT people. You need to get with your IT people. What is it going to be necessary as far as what kinds of internet are they going to need? What kind of computers? What kind of phones? And making sure you have because you want to be able to use either WebEx or Zoom or one of those facilities so that people can talk to each other, because that's a very important part of being able to work from home and working together. And also have a process by which everyone can reach documents that are needed, and they need to be, in our firm, for example, we use something called SharePoint, which I think is pretty popular. And it's basically a cloud-based document service where anybody from the firm can reach out and grab that. And lastly, something that people haven't really talked too much about is data security. And one of the issues I've seen floating around but not really focused on is it's crucial that that your information as an organization be protected from being hacked through some insecure entrance, which can often happen. So that's back to your IT people. And this needs to have been done yesterday. I mean, I think you just need to come out with a very simple policy and work through whatever the hoops. And a related technology issue is time tracking. Again, FLSA requires that you track time for those who are non-exempt if they're working from home. You need to have procedures that are easy for them to use to enter their time. Again, as a law firm, we do enter our time on a regular basis, basically daily, and we have a process by which we do that. And so you need to come up with a process by which you can do that and keep track of it. Anything else, Bert or David?
No, I don't think so on those. I mean, that's not only enter the time, but get the time, processed for payroll.
Correct.
I mean, this whole thing, when you talk about people working virtually, all the backroom function, it isn't just the outward-facing client or customer, it's all the backroom function. How that the payroll is being prepared and computed, and that the people's timesheets are evaluated and toted up and entered, whether you have a third-party vendor or whether you do the time check deposits yourself. By the way, might add, those of you that are paying by paper check, you may want to think about a direct deposit, some other
Exactly.
changes the mechanics. So the more electronic you can be, at least at this point, as long as the internet holds up, the better we are.
You know, this is the typical can of worms. You know, you send someone home to work from home, you have to track their hours, then you have to get it to your payroll department, then they have to get it to your ADT or PayPal, whoever.
Right.
I mean, it's just a cascading
Right.
issue that you have to get control of.
Right. It's just there are a lot of those issues to be thought through. It's not just sending the worker home. We got to we got to make sure the all the functionality can still be maintained. So, what about travel? What about travel?
Well,
that's another critical area.
Well, and travel changed since we did this slide yesterday. The president has now banned all travel from non-nationals into the United States from Europe. In addition to, I know China's on the list, Italy's on the list, and so that creates basically, I think, international travel for now, except that which is absolutely essential, is probably shut down for all intents and purposes for the next few weeks. Quick story, my brother and sister-in-law were getting on a plane to Portugal just as the president announced the ban, and so they got off the plane and did not go because they couldn't afford to be stuck in Portugal for 30 days.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
and so I'm sure other.
Well, I just want to point out, it's not just the international travel that we focus on, but the domestic travel.
Correct.
You know, whether
That's
it's
next.
trains, planes, metro, all provides the same challenges, and increasingly, I think, are facing some of the same restrictions. For the reasons that we saw last night, a customer gets on a JetBlue flight out of New York, flies to Palm Beach, discloses while in flight that they have tested positive.
Got on the plane.
They're on the plane.
No, you're kidding.
Okay. So this is a level of irresponsibility. So now we have a plane load of people. I mean, thank heavens it was disclosed so they could at least deal with it when the plane landed, but the whole plane load, et cetera, before they fanned out. So I'm just saying that's an irresponsible person, obviously. But the problem is that in these this is why the social distancing is one of the reasons why it's important.
I am a metro rider, and social distancing is easy because these trains are empty.
Right.
Correct.
Right.
I was on a flight from Phoenix.
What about personal travel?
From Phoenix. Well, I think the other thing is that we need to monitor. You need to consider monitoring employees' personal travel. As pointed out here, it's spring break time. It's baseball is starting up, and people are flying to Florida and so forth. You need to let them know that it's possible they may be quarantined for 2 weeks or restricted from returning until it's clear they don't have the disease. I think it's important to let people know that you're going to be doing that right up front so they can make arrangements. And it is easy, to some extent, it's easy to cancel right now because everybody understands what's going on. Anything else from you all?
There's an interesting complication for a number of people at this particular time. With all of the colleges and universities going online, spring break is the traditional time for high school juniors and seniors to do college visits all over the country. So it may be that enormous migration will be halted or suspended or altered, which is a good thing.
I think the only final note, and then we'll move off this, on employees' personal travel, there is a question as to how far the employer's interests legitimately extend into monitoring, probing, being kept abreast of what people are doing in their personal time. So I think the key point here is that I think should make sure employees understand the CDC's guidances and warnings. You should indicate that if people do, on their personal travel, for example, would travel to a restricted area under CDC guidelines, they absolutely will not be permitted back in the workplace. If you go to China, for example, today, on a personal trip, we would not want you back in the workplace. And that these situations can change rapidly, and you may, that it just is illustrated by the decision your family members made, Nita, to actually, even literally as they stepped on the plane to make a U-turn and get off.
Exactly.
So, but I think that's kind of the outer boundary of where an employer can go.
Yeah.
And as illustrated by I'll call it the knucklehead that got on the plane and didn't disclose, we still are dependent on people's candor. And part of that goes back to why it's so important not to stigmatize, to make sure that people will be assured that their job won't be jeopardized if they just are candid and disclose. All right.
Right.
So that kind of sets up nicely a communication program.
Sure does.
I'll just chat about that while I have the floor. But this is something that I think, some regular communications, because every person in this country is concerned about this. Some people are almost panic-stricken. A large segment of our population, growing segment, may be panicked. But every person in our workforce is concerned. They're concerned about their own health, their colleagues' health, their family's health. So some mechanism to ensure that people are kept abreast, that they know that you as an employer are concerned about it, that you're taking steps to respond. There are a lot of devices, think about your normal communication tools, web page, email, etc., but start thinking about how you are messaging, communicating, any policy changes, any steps you're taking, even it's as simple as a stepped-up hand washing, hand sanitizing, basic health protocols in the office environment, making sure those are fully communicated, encouraging people to talk about those, recognizing that if an emergency situation arises, that rapid communication, don't be stumbling around and not knowing how to get hold of every single person. That means that you have their cell phone numbers, that larger organizations will have an appropriate phone tree. This is preparedness 101. That gets done in advance before you need to pull it out. And you make sure that people, the critical people who initiate and start that, have that information at their fingertips 24/7. It isn't just kept in the office drawer, but if they need it during off hours, that they have it.
And let me just emphasize the speed with which this situation changes. In the District of Columbia,
Unbelievable.
in the space of 2 hours, we went from a health advisory, which simply was that, to a state of emergency. And the difference between those two is almost impossible to articulate. And that had to be communicated to employers and businesses and agencies all over this town and its environs. So the necessity for having the mechanism for doing so is imperative, because you don't want to be caught short. Remember our first slide? You have an obligation to keep your employees informed about emerging health situations.
Right. So communication plan is a critical component. All right, Bert. Well, what about in the unfortunate situation that based on the odds some of us will face having to manage a sick employee?
Now, I don't know how I got the short stick to do this. This is a tough one. This is what we're facing every day. We don't know exactly how to do it. We don't know. We're laymen. We don't know the difference between a cough and a cold and a flu and a COVID-19. So we take the most extreme position, and this follows the CDC guidelines. If someone falls ill, seems ill, tests positive, unlikely with the absence of test, has a suspected but unconfirmed respiratory ailment, go to the extreme. Please advise that person, send that person home. Send everybody with whom that person worked home for at least the 14 days advised by the CDC. Before you send anybody home who seems ill, find out with whom they have been in contact for the rest of that day and even longer if possible. I realize this is crazy advice and that you may be decimating an entire department of your business, but it is the only option that we have. And of course, the last one is, because you may be able to send a number of people home, you obviously do not want to identify and therefore stigmatize any single employee who is the one that started this chain of events. David, you're about to add.
I was just going to say, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which has been widely reported, is a good example of exactly how this occurred. Late in the day on Monday of this week, the agency learned that one of its employees who'd been at work that day was feeling ill, was in the process, and had a medical check, and the doctor said it's highly likely that this person, we're testing, but the test takes several days. It's highly likely that they are going to be positive. They have all symptoms. That was the medical opinion. Immediately, because they had the communication chain in place, they notified every employee. via text message, via email, and they were able to turn it on a dime, remove people immediately, starting the next morning, et cetera. So it puts in place kind of they didn't identify who the person was.
Right.
They explained the situation factually. It wasn't hysteria, and they've gone from there.
By the way, it's easy for us to say this. There's a whole chain of events that exist behind this slide. Who's responsible for making this decision? Who's responsible for making the identification? Who's responsible for getting the word out? Those are steps you should take now.
Correct.
Before an emergent event.
Right.
Have this system in place because, as the SEC showed, you must act promptly to protect the community, to protect your entities, and to protect your employees.
And I just want to underscore that. Deciding who the decider will be for your organization,
Correct.
that needs to be decided now, in advance. Because you don't want a local manager. Am I authorized to do this? Do I have to wait and hear from the president? Do I have to? Well, I mean, and there's no right or wrong answer. Just whatever your decision-making tree is, so the communication tree, now the decision tree, is put in place.
The point that the analogy to be made is with a natural disaster.
Right.
If there is a flood in your community, if there's a fire on your block, someone should be in charge of telling people what to do. The same thing obtains here. What
when
happens
I worked
Please, go ahead.
I was just going to say, when I worked for DuPont, they had the most amazing information system so that people who needed to be aware would be contacted, and basically it was a phone tree everywhere because, of course, they would have spills and other things like that, so they were used to it. I think the harder thing is for for our clients and others who aren't necessarily used to that, that need for having that in place immediately, and everybody knows who goes next and who's in charge, and all those decisions are already made.
If the eventuality occurs, and this may be very hard because talk about healthcare workers being in short supply, cleaning companies are overwhelmed. If you have an outbreak, if you have an incident, if someone is removed from the office because of a confirmed or suspected coronavirus outbreak, do everything you can to get your facility back to a state where you can comfortably invite your workers back in, and they have to be comfortable enough to return to work. Remember that first slide about the OSHA general purpose clause? You need to provide a workplace that is safe and secure for your employees. The next is kind of out of our lane in terms of legal advice, but you are probably getting emails from many institutions and organizations going from restaurants to Kennedy Center about what these institutions are doing to make their places a safe place to visit. I cannot tell you the significance and importance and the difference it is making between the kinds of places that have made these public announcements and those that have not, those that have been tardy, places that are telling you that all of their facilities are being cleaned every night, all of their workers are wearing gloves. It's a world of difference between those institutions that are doing so and those institutions that are behind the eight ball. Last, of course, stay up to date. I am confident that now at 10 o'clock or now at 1 o'clock, we are an hour behind where we started. I'm giving you advice about the current situation. One of the problems with the coronavirus is that it grows exponentially. Stay tuned to the local and federal guidances that you're receiving. Consider how to incorporate emerging recommendations about workplace-specific plans, because more and more localities, from cities to counties to states, are moving up the ladder of emergency cautions. And, respond in kind when you have a state of emergency declared. find out what it means. Does it mean shutting down, or does it mean only for, gatherings of 500? Learn the details and learn how they apply to you, and have your plans in place.
Well, and I think,
doing so.
And I think, Bert, it's helpful to sort of think through thoughtfully in the particular context of everyone's workplace. What can we do? I mean, the core principle that is embedded in the CDC advice is to try to minimize contact.
Right.
Now, some jobs, you've got to show up to do them. There's no phoning in, changing beds in a hotel, and room cleaning and so forth. But, meetings or what the protocols are, making sure, the concept of critical employees, not necessarily everyone, maybe critical, maybe rotating shifts, thin shifts on site. I think that this point on cross-training,
very important.
having some redundancy, thinking, look, because if you listen to the experts, they tell us it's really more likely than not for many of us, not whether but when we may contract this. And so what would happen if they were a critical on-site person that physically had to be there? They had to remove them. Even if they weren't sick, just because they'd been exposed, you had to remove them for the 14 days. How are those functions going to continue? So some ability to have redundancy, because in many organizations you have critical so-called key people, and there is no redundancy.
Yeah.
And so to quickly get at least a baseline of some redundancy on every critical function, I think is something that all of us need to think about.
And this ties into what Nita was talking about in terms of telecommuting. When you're designing your telecommuting program, you have to bear in mind who can profitably and practically telecommute and who cannot.
Correct.
And that person has to have a doppelganger. That person has to have a double, so that at least two people can handle those tasks in the likelihood that one of them will be removed from the workplace. I close with these are the websites that you can rely on. Preeminently, CDC has the best advice. They have the website is quite spectacular in the sense that they have gone beyond simple health advice to social contact advice, to workplace advice, to healthcare advice, to the healthcare facility people that are on this phone. There's advice there for them. The OSHA guidance is kind of remarkable in that it kind of blows the limits off of what we thought OSHA was,
right,
and is much more amenable to having the employer act proactively under the guise of OSHA. The WHO, of course, is the premier source for international knowledge. It is tough to go beyond what they already have done. A worldwide pandemic has been declared, and that means all of their resources are available to all the countries of the world, and their advice should, of course, be heeded.
Well, let's just talk a little bit briefly, because we've got a few minutes here, and let's sort of wrap up with kind of the concept of acting now, and the types of plans that have been put in place. Some of these we've referenced. We've talked about the Securities and Exchange Commission, a federal agency, how they responded. Nita has mentioned rapidly the rollout of more robust compensated leave policies. We call them sick leave policies, but they may be for the individuals that are sick or the individuals that are sent home because others are sick.
Right.
That concept. The restrictions on travel, domestic, local, and this all deals with mass contact and trying to minimize mass contact. That is the organizing principle here that animates all of these policies.
Well, it is not revelatory to tell you that we are working with clients who are at the point of closing their buildings, so that no one gets in except the people that they can monitor themselves.
Closing the buildings, making
remarkable.
people certify in
Right.
terms of doing some basic health assessments as people enter a premise, and certainly again in circumstances where you have aged populations, other healthcare facilities, particular scrutiny on who is allowed in both as a contractor, as a visitor, as an employee. to avoid the unintended possible contamination of that workplace.
And I think you also have to keep your ear tuned to Congress. Emergency measures
Correct.
are being introduced today. It is not unlikely that we are going to have some new laws by the end of the week or by the beginning of next week, which will have an immediate impact on your capabilities for subsidizing absent workers and subsidizing idle workers.
Yeah, there does seem to be, notwithstanding a lack of consensus on much of anything, that there could be improvement in that area by Congress. Nita?
There's one additional thing I was going to mention. Starbucks, which is sort of typical of retail organizations, they're offering time off with pay for 2 weeks, and if people need it, they will be able to get pay for up to 26 weeks, which I think is a huge step forward, considering many employers have not, especially retail employers, have not been particularly supportive of paid sick leave except where required. And I think this opens a whole new can of worms when we are done with this pandemic. What changes will it make to the workplace that we have seen up to this point in time?
Agreed. Well, we're right at the end of our time, and Nita, I'm going to give you the final word, if you will, for us.
Well, we just wanted to leave everyone with one little thought. I love Thoughts of Dog. This is the dog talking on it. It's a Twitter site, and just for those of you, the human's been working from home the last couple of days, and every so often they let me participate in video calls. I have a dog as well. All the other humans cheer when they see me. I'm the only thing holding their company together, and there's the dog.
I don't doubt it for a minute.
So we thought on what is a rather dark topic, trying to end with a somewhat light touch on what is obviously a very serious subject. But listen, we want to thank each and every one of you for joining us. We had a lot of folks that showed up and are on the call. We appreciate your interest. If anyone is interested in a copy of these materials, get in touch with any of us or with the firm. We're happy to share. We think the more that we can put this word out there and help people in addressing these issues, we're really pleased to do that.
There's also other materials on the website.
Right. And if you have specific questions or issues, obviously give us a call, and we'd be happy to work through those with you. So with that, we will say thank you. Stay well, stay healthy, and maintain social distancing. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.